Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you. Good to see you. Welcome, everybody. Uh, Good morning. Good morning. Obviously, it was a really rough weekend. I think for a lot of folks. It was good. I was out at a protest yesterday. It was good to see folks out there, but it's pretty horrifying in terms of what's going on the ground in Gaza and Rafah right now. And so before we started, Tracy and I were both talking about that a little bit. And so anyways, we have obviously scheduled this. This is a really important discussion. This article is excellent. I encourage people to read it. I really enjoy talking to Tracy. We did um, an interview with them back in, I think it was 2022, for the piece on, I think it's entitled Inside LA's Homeless Industrial Complex. And there's a link to that in the show description people can check out. Be sure to do the basic things, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Um, One thing on subscriptions, we're getting close to 6,000 and could hit that by the end of the week. And so that would just be a cool milestone. So if you haven't done that already, please do so. Um, Let me go ahead and introduce Tracy, and then we will get into this discussion. Um, so, Tracy Rosenthal has written for The Nation, the Los Angeles Times, and elsewhere. Rosenthal's book, Abolish Rent, written with Leonardo Vilches, I think that's correct. They'll correct me if I mispronounce it, is forthcoming on Haymarket Books. That'll be out later this year. I really look forward to reading that. Um, Tracy, welcome back to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It's great to be in conversation with you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. As I said, really enjoy the piece. Encourage folks to check it out. I'll say, like, just as an introductory thing, that I've mentioned this to you, but I'll say it to folks, and I'll be referencing it a few times in the conversation. Is that I grew up about 25 minutes driving from Grants Pass, and so this is an interesting piece for me. It's interesting to have Grants Pass be in the kind of national spotlight. That's a very weird and unusual thing. And obviously the focus of this is around a really important Supreme Court case that is currently in front of the court. In the court, they could decide on it, I think, any day now, pretty much. Um, and so yeah, we'll talk more about Grants Pass as we get into this. But obviously this has national implications. So last time, as I mentioned, we had you on to discuss the piece on Inside LA's Homeless Industrial Complex. And today we're going to discuss an article which is not exactly directly related to that piece, but obviously is about the same general topic, which is like homelessness and how it is policed and managed in our society. Is there a relationship that how do you think about those two pieces in relationship to each other?
Yeah, and I guess just like you, I want to start before I say anything else. I just want to, note that like I'm sure everyone is seeing the images, but it's like we're about to talk about encampments while there's another tent massacre going on, and like Israel is deliberately bombing civilians displaced multiple times by their campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing, and this brutality is occurring with the backing of the United States under a Democratic president, right? So like throughout this conversation, my support is with the people of Palestine resisting Zionist extermination by whatever means. And as we turn and like talk about the campaigns of dehumanization and social murder that are happening against people who are living in tents here, right? Like, I don't want to overstate the similarity, but I do really believe that the struggle for unhoused people's self-determination, like that's a land struggle on American soil. And that struggle is bound up with the struggle for a free Palestine and for the right of return. So just to like really ground us in that. But yeah, to answer the question about like the relationship between my last two pieces, in that first piece, the homeless industrial complex, I was writing about a militarized sweep of an encampment at Echo Park Lake. And about 150 unhoused people had been living there until March of 2021, when the city sent in 700 cops in riot gear to clear the park and the group of supporters that had risen to defend that encampment. And that in that piece, I was trying to, situate that like eviction at gunpoint within this, dilemma, or like this specifically liberal dilemma of our moment that has to do with the role of real estate capital in urban space. And basically, like, this is thinking about how, our municipal economies are more and more dependent on the inflation of property values and on real estate speculation. And like in this context, right, like homelessness itself becomes a limit to capital, becomes a limit to that process. So like visible poverty is really getting in the way of a city's ability to market itself as a safe investment and as like safe for rich people, right? And so like this contradiction really like the way that cities resolve this contradiction is by giving police a greater and greater role in pushing poor people out of urban space. And so like in that, I talk about how the city council person representing the area at the time called that like militarized sweep the greatest housing event in the history of the city, right? So it's like referring to this sweep as a housing event. And then what we see a year later is that 7% of the people who were swept had permanent housing, half were missing, and 9 had died. And what that shows, right, is like, I mean, not that we need more proof, but it, like, obviously what this shows is that sweeps don't solve homelessness, right? They like make unhoused people's lives more miserable. They perpetuate homelessness by putting up roadblocks to the kinds of support that people need and put them at further risk in even of death, right? So, that was sort of the occasion for the last piece. And for the current piece, I'm thinking about a Supreme Court case that is coming out of, as you said, Grants Pass, Oregon, which is a town of 40,000 people, right? That now this town of 40,000 people could rewrite the scripts of homelessness policy for the entire United States. And in that case, like in this case, an unhoused woman sued the city and won. Basically, the district court and the Ninth Circuit Court agreed with her, right, that the city's laws were effectively cruel and unusual, inflicting cruel and unusual punishment. They had punished the involuntary status of homelessness. But of course, the city was unsatisfied with this, and they've appealed the case all the way to the Supreme Court. And as you said, like, we could get the ruling really soon, and it will likely be by the end of the month. And just like the bigger story that I'm telling in that piece is about this kind of national bipartisan backlash against encampments, against unhoused people who are living in tents in public space, and also like the policy backlash against those like very policies that are proven to house people long term.
That's great. Thank you for the context of that. Yeah, and I I love that aspect of the piece too, because, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit more, but like on one level we could say, well, yeah, it's just this small town, like why should it sort of decide everything? But it is also like that there's all of these forces, right, that are lining up around this decision, and so yeah, it's anyway. Um so as I mentioned, I grew up in this area. I never studied it, but it was one of the closest towns to where I grew up, which I grew up in a rural area, and there was some like lore, or like local kind of knowledge of the area, and it's interesting. I mean, the piece you entitled it "The New Sundown Towns," and um, folks wouldn't know this unless they've kind of looked at it into its history a little bit. But Grants Pass actually was a sundown town. Well, at least till 1970. But I mean, even as like my parents moved there around 70, 71, like I believe there still was a sign. There was still like a lot of local kind of knowledge of this history. And Obviously, it has diversified some in the last few years, as a lot of the Southern Oregon area has. Um, but that's an interesting, also kind of aspect of it. It gives people a sense too. I mean, we're talking about an area that's historically very white. Oregon, of course, was founded as a white utopia around the time of the
Mhm,
Civil War.
mhm,
Um, and it has this. It originally, in the Oregon Constitution, there were laws that said like black people couldn't own
mhm,
property within the state and things
mhm,
like that, right? And so it's interesting, right? Also, that this is now a site of where we might think about a policy around kind of what it would mean to be a sundown town with regard to homeless folks as well. Um, and uh, Anyway,
mhm,
I just was interested in you starting to lay out kind of some of the local dynamics of the town
mhm,
that you examined, right? Because you're looking at it in 2024. This is, you know, 1970 is 54 years ago. It has
mhm.
changed some, but there are interesting local political dynamics in Grants Pass, and you
Mhm.
look at some of those.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely, right? Like establishing these new policies as a part of that longer history of white supremacy is really crucial, right? Like, as you said, Grants Pass was a literal sundown town, and the Klan held hooded marches on 6th Street. The local newspaper had warned, like, people of color, you better roll up your bed and ride. And we see like the legacy of property ownership. And the like exclusions around property ownership that like persisted beyond the like even beyond like its formal legalization. And so like and part of that is a Klan presence and a vigilante presence that is maintained to this day. And I think we see echoes of that in the treatment of unhoused people over the last decade, right? Like when the town's ordinance are designed, right? There we have evidence from this roundtable that they held on the city's vagrancy problems that the like one official is saying, the point is to make people so uncomfortable such that they move on down the road, right? So like this constant portrayal of homeless people out as outsiders and who don't belong, and the like growing vigilante violence against unhoused people in the community now, like people throw trash and honk their horns all night, and like there's even like one homeowner brought a gun to an encampment and fired shots into the air, right? So I feel like it's really important, as you said, to name that legacy of white supremacy and how that legacy feeds into the sort of new economic and political regimes that sit on top of it, right? And we know that dispossession and displacement have long been tools of racial domination, just as racial domination has long been a tool of class rule. And so, like the legacy of like that racism of white supremacy means that Grants Pass is overwhelmingly white, but of course, people of color are overrepresented in its homeless population. And that's true across the country, right? Like people of color and specifically Black people are vastly overrepresented in homeless populations. And as I say in the piece, right, like this turns homelessness into a really effective proxy for race and racism. And so when you see the kind of like punditry that is engaged in the dehumanization of the homeless, right, which is a seemingly race neutral category, it's actually helping launder their racism at like in 2024 at a time where like doing that so overt, like you're not really allowed to do that so overtly anymore. And so, it's like, as we know, that there's an entire media ecosystem are like on the right built around filming unhoused people without their permission, sharing images of distress, and politicizing this as a way of demonstrating the kind of failures of liberal governance, as well as just like dehumanize people and like preach their sort of vision of individual accountability, like to continue their crusade to undermine systems of social support and like make sure that any kind of meager social assistance is tied to discipline and coercion. And I think one simplified instantiation of this is the Ron DeSantis slogan, like "Don't let Florida become San Francisco," right? That the proliferation of encampments is is being used as a recruitment tool on the right. And I guess, yeah, just to say more about the kind of specific economic dynamics of Grants Pass, right? Like the town's industry until the 70s was timber, and which of course collapsed. And so in the 80s and 90s, there was a massive recession and like so many people lost their jobs, weren't employed. And we see here as elsewhere, right, that like what has revived the economy has been real estate, tourism, and service, right? And these are very different types of jobs where people have very different access, like the fewer unions, fewer, like less healthcare, way fewer protections, and also like a rapid increase in property values and in rents. And in the last 2 decades, the city has almost doubled in size. And these sort of streams have converged, right, into a vast increase in homelessness. And I think that it's important to say, like, this is a dynamic that has played out across the country. And, like I say in the last piece, right, like I think Eric Garcetti, probably like Los Angeles's former mayor, summarized this the best when he says, in a good economy, homelessness goes up. Right. And like that, really names this dynamic where municipalities are relying on real estate speculation for revenue. Homeowners are relying on inflating property values for like any sort of financial security. And tenants, meanwhile, are relying on doubling up and starving to pay the rent. And so I think, it's like, putting it in that broader economic context, like really illustrates how homelessness is not, the problem of individuals, but of an economic system that we've designed such that it now takes 4 full-time minimum wage jobs to afford the typical 2-bedroom rent. And then maybe to just speak about the political dynamics of the town, and I think we'll probably get into this further later, right? But I talk about sort of the 2 camps, right? Like the liberals and the conservatives, right? And the sort of flag flyers and the lawn signs, like the flags and the lawn signs, like being their sort of symbols of choice. And like right now, the right wing in the town is participating in 2 state secessionist movements. There's the Greater Idaho movement, which wants to take that part of rural Southern Oregon and join Idaho, where most voters voted for Trump. And there's the state of Jefferson movement, which wants to create a new state with the like northern rural part of California, basically to get away from the representation of urban centers there, right? And so, this is the right wing that like in 2020, they held an open carry guard of their American flag in the center of town, and were patrolling the roof of the Baskin Robbins. There are like photos of people with their guns out on the roof of the Baskin Robbins, right? And so, right-wing politicians are sort of like feeding on this groundswell of feeding on this base to, like basically address homelessness with a combination of state abandonment and state violence, right? They are extremely organized to block any state funding from addressing the crisis, and even going so far, they've like refused to issue state of emergency declarations that could open up funding. They've like refused resources at every turn. And at the same time, right, they're trying to like expand police powers and funnel all support through charity, religious organizations, and forced treatment programs, and basically like enact their fantasy that you can deter people from being homeless if only you got to punish them enough, right? And then like on the other side, right, or like what is supposedly the other side of the political spectrum, like is, the liberals or the center, which I think is like a perspective that's mostly represented through the town's mayor, who is in many ways like aligned with a similar project, right? Like we see it over and over that constituency has its like own models of deterrence, right? Where they push to expand shelter, not for, humanitarian reasons, not to provide housing because people need housing, but to have more places to push people, and have more people and have more places to contain people, right? Like for the sake of this like revanchist attack on urban space that they share with the right. And so, I mean, I think it's ironic, the right wing in the town had organized this recall of the mayor, like under the banner of take back the parks from unhoused people. And, when the mayor talks about opening shelter, she says it's such that we can take back our parks. And the kind of like real, like lack of daylight between engineering sundown towns was really like what I was trying to sort of like break open in the piece.
Yeah, I mean, and just to add some other context of just my own experience too, like I would say also it's an area, Grants Pass, but like the Rogue Valley in general, it follows this river called the Rogue River. That you're like you said, those job opportunities, right? Like a lot of people are working in service jobs. Obviously, there are these other layers of people who have more money for sure, but there's a lot of service workers and there's not a lot of housing also that's available to people who have service jobs. I mean, it's very difficult to find, as is the case around the country increasingly, wherever you go. It's very difficult to find housing that could actually, give you something that you could afford on, a service work kind of position. And so there's also just you kind of I think talked about this, but there's kind of an economic reality also that constantly creates the issue of a lack of housing that people can access, and I think that's a really important element of it as well. And yeah, I mean, there are so many interesting points. I'm glad you brought up the secessionist movements. I mean, there's some really interesting just history of these like kind of settler militias, that goes back a long ways. And they even when there's protests locally in the areas like BLM protests or Pride or things like this, like, well, they just started doing Pride like I think a year or two ago
Mm-hmm.
in Medford. But these groups will mobilize and intimidate folks too, and so there is like these kind of dynamics as well, where even, like liberal, like you say, it is the yard signs, like it is kind of like it's difficult to be active in any way more um, um militantly or aggressively kind of in the region sometimes because people are afraid of vigilante violence also, and so that's a part of the kind of region's history as
Mm-hmm.
well. So but one of the interesting things that you look at in this piece is the law firm that's representing Grants Pass in this case, and um the forces that get behind this, which includes, very right wing think tanks and stuff like this, and also, very quote unquote progressive cities. So, talk a
Mm-hmm.
little bit about kind of who these forces and this alignment of forces around this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So the law firm Gibson Dunn, which is represented Grants Pass in the Supreme Court case, basically seeking to overturn prior court rulings and expand the powers of police such that they can make a blanket ban on sleeping in public. Like that's what the case is about. And that law firm also defended Chevron in its like in trying to defeat a class action pollution suit. It defended the the company behind the Dakota Access Pipeline. It was the same firm that won unlimited campaign financing in Citizens United. And in 2000, that same firm successfully argued the case that blocked the Florida recount and put George W. Bush in the White House, right? So, like, I think it's really important to establish this case as another notch in this, like, bedpost of conservative attacks, right? Like, that the supermajority of the like the right-wing supermajority of the court means that, you know, that institution has been turned into a weapon to restrict civil liberties, criminalize the poor, and enrich the rich, right? And we've already seen in the last just few years, right, that same court has restricted abortion, it's undermined the EPA, curtailed affirmative action, and like voided pandemic eviction moratoriums, right? So I think placing this case as a part of a broader right-wing project of criminalizing the poor, restricting civil liberties, and leveraging the court specifically for that purpose is really helpful. But yeah, as you said, you know, like the one thing that I like really wanted to make clear is that like the criminalization of homelessness is a bipartisan project, you know, and we see that in the support of this case. So Democratic politicians across the West, which is right now like the jurisdiction that's covered by the Ninth Circuit, is home to half of all unsheltered homeless people in the country, I should say, like specifically the homeless population that lives outdoors. And so many of them sent what's like, you know, amicus briefs or what's called like friend of the court briefs to the court, basically begging it to take the case, right? So like these supposedly liberal jurisdictions calling on that arch conservative Supreme Court, which we know is in a frenzy of restricting rights, calling on that court to govern their own jurisdictions. And that included LA, Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, and California's governor, Gavin Newsom, right? And so, you know, I thought it was interesting that liberal media really like presented this overlap as like a rare alliance between liberals and the right. But, you know, it's like this is really an ongoing bipartisan project. And for like liberals have really no imagination for the kind of transformative policies we would need to actually stop people from becoming homeless. But they want to be able to show progress on the issue that is becoming like more and more important to their constituents as the crisis gets worse and worse, right? So like, you know, I feel like one of the things that I was trying to bring out was the way in which criminalization serves this kind of like dual function for liberals, right? Where they can both claim criminalization as like a mode of care that pushes people to accept the services they need, but also, right, it's like a way that they can show progress on the issue of homelessness by basically shuffling the problem around, by like removing people from sight, by like, you know, like I think Paul Bowden of the Western Regional Advocacy Project put it to me this way, like, we don't have a homeless problem if we don't see homeless people, right? So like basically removing the visible signs of the crisis from public space is their strategy for dealing with the problem. And, you know, these court rulings have been a real embarrassment for them because they reveal just how punitive and pointless their policies are. And so like literally crossing the line of the bare minimum protections afforded by the United States Constitution, right? And their response has not been to shift directions or to house people, right? To like rethink their overall strategy of using police as their outreach workers and jail as their housing, right? They like instead they have tried to politicize the courts, right? Basically shifting the blame for the encampments onto the courts. And we've seen this, you know, like throughout the West, that as these sort of rulings come out that use the Eighth Amendment to say like you can't go further than this. Like this is the line of criminalization beyond which you have like started, but beyond which constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. That there have been cases like throughout the Ninth Circuit in Los Angeles, and then in Martin v. Boise, which is like the more famous case that sort of preceded this Grants Pass case, that made this embarrassing determination. And the way that liberals have responded is by protesting the courts. And seeking the support of the conservative Supreme Court to overturn prior liberal court rulings. And like, that's how you get Mayor London Breed standing on the steps of the Ninth Circuit Court, quoting Fannie Lou Hamer while saying that like she wants more power to sweep people off the streets.
What a crazy, crazy timeline we live in.
Yeah.
Uh, Good morning to some of the folks joining us. I see some folks from the West Coast. Good morning. The flip side of this, of course, is that among, homeless people, you spend some time
Mhm,
in the piece, and it's again, beautifully written piece. I recommend people read it all for themselves. But talking to also some of the homeless folks in Grants Pass, and
mhm,
they live in a reality that one of the homeless folks you interviewed described as a cyclical hell.
mhm,
And you talked to also in your previous piece on the LA industrial homeless industrial complex,
mhm,
about the very dystopian kind of carcerality
mhm,
of some of these solutions, which there included like putting people in shipping containers and things
mhm.
like this. And so, um, say a little bit about your experience with this in the Grants Pass context.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to like, just to be clear, right? So the Oregon District Court and then the Ninth Circuit Court both ruled that Grants Pass's laws violated unhoused people's constitutional Eighth Amendment protections against cruel and unusual punishment. But the only thing that ruling made illegal, right? Like the only thing that the ruling prevented was a total ban on sleeping in public on every inch of public land 24 hours a day, right? So Grants Pass and every other city that's like, under the jurisdiction of Martin v. Boise, like that is enjoined from issuing total bans on homelessness, right? Like people like these municipalities still have immense powers, and and those powers are, like time, place, and manner restrictions. And so they basically have every capacity to say where and how and when an unhoused person can be, right? And nothing about these rulings prevents them from enforcing their drug laws or their health laws. So like all of this, like all of this sort of noise that, the lawyers and the city makes about like the prevalence of drugs or like the dangers of fires or diseases, right? Like there's nothing in these court rulings that actually prevents that, right? So even under this court injunction, like what, and that's when I went to visit people, like they are protected by the court injunction, and the cyclical hell that they live in is the protections to them afforded by the courts, right? So just making it very clear that like what this case is about is the dividing line between unusual cruelty and usual cruelty. And the kind of usual cruelty that I saw when I was there, right? And that people talked about experiencing on a daily basis, right? Unhoused people are subject to fines and jail time for violating an invention called buffer zones, right? Which is basically just like a certain amount of distance that you are legally allowed to be in proximity to a path or to a structure. They're criminalized for taking up too much space. They are limited in the amount of space that they can take up to a total of 8 by 8 feet. They can't have any more belongings beyond that, right? They're not allowed to have stakes and tent stakes, like the literal in the freezing weather. They can't have heaters, right? That could protect them. And like, so even as this court injunction allowed them to be in Grants Pass parks, they're still subject to all of these rules. And probably like the one that they deal with the most is that they are swept every 72 hours. So every 72 hours, they have to pick up everything they own and move it between the only places that they're allowed to be, which is the other parks, right? So this is that kind of cyclical hell of going from place to place. And I think it really sort of speaks to the churn that these policies of sweeps and criminalization cause, that like that there is no, like, that the vision is preventing people from having a sense of ownership over place, preventing people from forming communities and like keeping themselves safe, really like wasting their time, and like degrading their mental and physical health, all in the service of, like, and in the service of what, right? In the service of this idea that you can deter someone, from living outside, that it has a peniological purpose to criminalize someone from being homeless. And I mean, I should just say for further context, right, that like, there's 2 police officers in the town whose entire job is to police the unhoused residents of the park. And there are a total of 6 police officers on patrol at a given time, right? So that's a third of the city's budget for public safety, which itself is a third of the entire city's budget, is going to just this, like policing basically a population of 500 people, right? So just like trying to get a handle on the scale of resources that are being directed to this mode of addressing the crisis of homelessness. And, again, like all of this is legal according to the courts. Like this is under the injunction. This is before the Supreme Court has allowed things to get even worse, right? So I think, like, I think it's just important to point out, right, the best case scenario in the outcome of the case is what we have right now, which is vast powers to criminalize poverty, to jail, ticket, and immiserate unhoused people. And and I think just to like continue this this campaign of discipline and incarceration as crime, as punishment for the crime of not being able to afford rent.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and also appreciate the kind of budgetary context. I mean, I kind
Mhm.
of smirked as you're talking about this, and we'll get to it a little bit more, but, like, even in the Rogue Valley, like, Grants Pass is known particularly as a region that does not like to pay anything into government. Like,
Mhm.
they don't, it is a very
It's the lowest property taxes in
yeah.
the it's the lowest property taxes in the state, and like some of the lowest property taxes in the entire country.
Right, and there's no sales tax there, right? So it's like it's just important for people to understand that, like, they're every time, like, there would be a ballot measure for increasing the size of the police force or, increasing jail capacity, which we'll get to later,
Mhm.
like, this would get voted down. So, again, like, in a city that has very few police, that is not, and it's not because people don't have, like, kind of a carceral mindset. It's literally just because people don't wanna pay, the taxes to do these things. But still, like, the one thing that becomes this priority, right, is sweeping homeless folks. And so I think that's, like,
Mhm.
I don't know, it says something interesting about also, like, the priorities of, like, kind of a libertarian politics as well,
Mhm. And it says something about like what austerity is as a project.
Right,
It is a
right.
project of disciplining the poor. And I think to like, that the idea to, like the idea that we make sure that we rehearse, like we have to make sure that we continue to remind ourselves that like, budgets are political documents, and that kind of skeleton of the state that reveals its priorities, and the withholding of resources, right? Like the abandonment of resources, and the proliferation of violence as a strategy, like that those things are completely deeply interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely. Um So you write that criminalizing homelessness is an increasingly organized effort on the right. You discuss, in the piece things like camping bans and the rollback of
Mhm.
housing first policy. Can you
Mhm.
just talk a little bit about, like, kind of what these things are and some
Mhm.
of what, the right's working on right now?
Mhm. Yeah. So, I mean, like across the country, laws against homelessness are surging. Like over the last 20 years, laws against sitting, sleeping, asking for money, even like providing food to people who need food have just about doubled, across. And at the state level, right? Like, this is sort of where I point to that organized project. So one of the founders of Palantir, Joe Lonsdale, started this institute to like organize this project of criminalizing homelessness. And in about 12 states, they've successfully like passed or put on the legislative calendar, or are like in the process of introducing their template legislation, which does two things, right? They institute a total statewide ban on camping, and they remove funding from permanent housing and redirect it into temporary like shelter with mandatory treatment. And this is exactly what Trump has promised, right? Trump has promised a national camping ban and sanctioned tent cities with mandatory treatment. And he, like, over the course of his tenure in office, he appointed all, like, his council and economic advisors really like did the same thing, where they sort of questioned cities' permissiveness when it came to tent encampments. And they also questioned the funding of permanent housing rather than temporary shelter. And the Cicero Institute, right, calls what they want treatment first, not housing first. And similarly, Trump's like Council on Homelessness czar has said he prefers housing fourth. And what they're all referring to is this policy called Housing First, which is this bipartisan framework. And ironically, right, this is a policy framework that was popularized under George W. Bush, right? So they are, in fact, like seeking to undermine this this framework. And what that framework does, right, is what it says. It gives people housing first, and then any form of mental health care or substance abuse treatment is voluntary. And the idea, like has a lot of bipartisan support because one, it uses public resources more efficiently. And this is how like a lot of conservatives were brought into the banner of the policy, right? Is that it turns out that housing people is cheaper than policing them, jailing them, and repeatedly hospitalizing them. And then also because it works, right? Like the data really show that people, to a vastly large extent, stay housed when they are given permanent housing with access to like voluntary forms of treatment rather than the other way around. But right now, what we're living through is a backlash against this policy, and conservatives are turning against it in favor of mandatory treatment, and basically trying to institutionalize this idea that mental illness and addiction are the causes of homelessness, and also completely ignore the actual root causes of homelessness, right, which lie in our housing system and our economic system.
Absolutely. So then let's get to the other side of the aisle, quote unquote. So talk a little bit about, how like someone like Gavin Newsom, who, as you mentioned, also has written a brief or whatever in support of Grants Pass in this case. But, there's these ideas in California of like so-called care courts, and you referenced this slogan of his care, not cash. Talk a little bit about some of that, stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I should say that, like, ultimately speaking, like these liberal cities had sort of two rounds of sending the briefs, and the first one were like, please take the case, and then ultimately, like, most of them, but not all of them, switched to like in defense of neither party. So this kind of like neutral face-saving mechanism of, we asked the court to do this, but we don't really want to be held accountable for having done that. So now we're going to say that it's neutral, right? So like, just to not, like make sure that we're watching all of their little moves as they go about their day. But so I talk about Gavin Newsom in this piece, right? Because I feel like he loves two things. Like, one is alliteration and the other is care washing. And he, like, over the course of his career, like, we really see him very similarly to the right wing invoking treatment as a solution to homelessness. So Care Not Cash, like, was his program that he invented as San Francisco supervisor, where he basically removed money from people's welfare checks for shelter beds. And like under this paternalistic program of saying, like, people don't know how to take care of themselves. And the ads for the measure were, like, obviously actors playing unhoused people saying, I take your cash and I buy drugs, right? So that the kind of, he had very similarly leveraging, the drug scare and the war on drugs in order to like redirect this funding and enact these punitive policies. And then, right, as you mentioned, Care Courts as governor, he initiated these like new a new part of the civil court system, which basically allows judges to put people into forced treatment facilities. And, like Susan Meisner of the ACLU has once called this like a deprivation of civil liberties second only to the death penalty. And that is the kind of punishment that's being routed through the civil court system, and judges are given powers to do that. And then just this year, right, he passed the statewide ballot measure called Treatment Not Tents, and that was basically a method to fund the beds to put people in. And he has said, like the start of the homelessness crisis really began with the closure of mental health institutions, and is really sort of interested in like drawing the same line that conservatives are, and I think, I feel like it's important to name, right, for someone who wants to be president, he has a very unique relationship to the democratic process, right? He has won most of these measures on the ballot because he cannot pass them in the legislature, right? Like, there's no research that actually supports these ideas. So it's actually really hard to get the legislator to pass these laws. But there is, in fact, broad populist support for them to like turn to voters, to stir up this resentment, and to like make these care washing claims about helping people. And he's really successfully used that to get around the legislature and pass these like very and to sort of pass these laws that, I would say, right, you see this most starkly, like there's this like pundit Michael Schellenberger, and he wrote this book like Why Progressives Ruin Cities, and it proposes it has this fantasy of merging police and mental health institutions under this new agency called CalPsych in California. And Schellenberger has accused Gavin Newsom of stealing his idea. And so when you have a right-wing politician basically saying that they're in complete alignment, like, I think this is like when someone says who they are, like, believe them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. And I appreciate that. I mean, I think Newsom, as you said, he has presidential ambitions. He is
Mhm,
somebody I think that we're gonna have to be,
mhm,
come very those of us who don't live in California should be paying
mhm,
attention to kind of the way that he operates and the things that he has done in California.
mhm,
Um, all right. I have a couple more questions. I see one in the chat too. So, folks, I'll just
mhm,
say now, if you have additional questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll get to them in a minute. And just put question or a Q in front of it, just so that I can flag it from the other comments.
mhm,
Um, so you write about. I'm going to read a quick. Uh, let's see, a quick quote here,
mhm,
which is the sobering center that the city planned in its vagrancy roundtable opened its doors in 2016. The
mhm,
facility consists of 12 locked rooms where people can stay for up to 24 hours. And so, one, uh, I should just clarify for folks, this is in Grants Pass. Of course, we're back now talking about Grants Pass after giving some of that other context from around the country. But um, you know, again, like, important to say that this is in the context of a city that has 6 police officers. I don't know how many jail beds they currently have,
Mhm.
but for a long time they had like 2 or 3, and like we're trying for a very long time to get more, and people just wouldn't vote for it, right? Because again, like people don't want to spend money on these things generally in Grants Pass, and yet they were able to somehow get this facility with these 12 locked rooms for homeless people on this very temporary basis, which is interesting because it's kind of again a way to work around the idea, another area of we might think about carceral expansion or jail expansion. And
Mhm.
so um the other thing that you talk about a little bit is the town, which is about 20 miles up the road, Medford. It's a larger town.
Mhm.
And you noted in the piece that their solution to homelessness, you talk about that a little bit. And I should say I actually lived in Medford for a while. So do
Mhm.
you want to talk a little bit more about these local dynamics that you were looking at
Mhm.
here in the piece between Medford and Grants Pass?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I should say, like, that sobering center is a private facility. It
Right.
is not funded by the public, and that's part of its point, you know. And when you, what I mean, what I'm tracking in the piece is the way that the kind of treatment model is being used to like displace public responsibility onto these like very sort of shady nonprofit actors who are mostly engaged in the project of forced treatment. And we saw this like in the popularity of the sobering center, which, you know, like has a curfew from 6 to like, oh, this is actually like, this is the next place that I'll talk about. But, you know, the sobering center, it's like people are basically put there by the cops, locked there. Like it's unclear whether there are even beds, and they're locked there for up to 24 hours. You know, and this is what's being celebrated as like a part of the puzzle, a piece in the puzzle of solving homelessness, right? Is like this like jail by another name. And also, you know, one of the things that I track in the piece is the way that this like pre-treatment facility was opened in the town. And basically that's just like and it has a curfew from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. You're not allowed to have guests. Like you're sleeping in you're like in a congregate place, and you're basically waiting there to go into treatment elsewhere. So like the thing that basically you know, the city granted like almost $1 million, its only resources to start any kind of shelter, to have any like impact in the homelessness crisis in town. What they did with the money was open a pre-treatment facility. And you know, I think that it just really shows, it like really demonstrates the power of this ideology, right? That like, even though when you look at the statistics, it's like 16% of unhoused people across the country have some kind of substance abuse disorder. And this is like obviously like a real minority of the population. And of course, it doesn't really address how people use drugs to address the physical and emotional toll of living outside, right? To sleep when you can't get sleep, like to stay awake when you have no place to sleep, to deal with pain when you don't have access to medical care, right? Like all of these things that, like, you know, it that make it sort of more obvious that like solving one problem doesn't really solve another, right? But I think it really shows that like how powerful addiction is as a way of stigmatizing homelessness and individualizing homelessness and making homelessness seem like seem voluntary or like a choice, and therefore something that is deserving of punishment. And just to track like what specific facilities have been opened in the place, I think really helps us open out into the power of that idea. And then I will say, like, yeah, contrasting that with Medford, you know, and the Medford model is way more similar to like the Los Angeles model, where what they're engaged in and kind of like they have sanctioned encampments, they have tiny homes, They're investing in these kinds of what's called low barrier shelters. And low barrier shelters, people who work in them talk about the 3 Ps, like partners, pets, and property. Like you have more, like you have a little more freedom. You get to keep your stuff. You maybe can keep your pet. You like, and I think, and importantly, I think another thing that we should recognize from the dynamic of this town is like, these are not pray to stay facilities, right? Like the other side of the sobering center, that the one shelter in Grants Pass is the Gospel Rescue Mission, which is a pray to stay facility where people are subject to 29 rules, including attending church services under the dictates of the Apostles' Creed, quitting nicotine, and spending all of your time performing yourself in line with your quote unquote birth gender, right? So the Medford model is sort of like this, the centrist or liberal model that is in opposition to that. And yet, when you sort of like open up what people have to subject themselves in order to go into these spaces, right, which are like really paternalistic rules around like how much stuff you can bring into a place, when and where you can, when you have to be there, like these curfews that can be from like, what kind of adult do you know that has a curfew at 6 p.m., right? From 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., right? Like that when you start unpacking what people are subjected to in order to enter these spaces, what you see is that like, oh, like maybe this isn't really like shelter for the provision of a human need, but rather like another form of punishment for the crime of not being able to afford rent, right? This kind of expansion of shelter capacity is an expansion of incarceration and containment, right? To remove people from the streets and place them elsewhere. And I think too, right, like the courts themselves, cities have responded to these court injunctions by like proliferating these containment strategies, right? And so when courts have said, no, you can't arrest people if they have nowhere else to go, cities have looked at that and said, like, okay, we need to build these temporary shelters so that we can remove people off the street, right? And we see this in Las Vegas and San Diego, which is it basically taking this calculus of beds versus tents. As if you have enough beds, the police have free reign to ticket and arrest people for trying to sleep on the street. And so, and I think really like one of the best examples of this is in Sacramento, where the mayor has proposed a right to shelter that comes with an obligation for unhoused people to use it, right? And this is like a right to shelter is basically like a right to police the poor.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. And, again, like those are some of the dynamics that you really laid out thoroughly also in that previous piece, inside the LA's homeless industrial complex as well. Um, and yeah, in Medford, you mentioned the religious organizations. It made me think of another organization that a former school board member there used to run that was like for mothers and for, and it was all, again, like it was expecting mothers or young mothers who are fleeing abuse or who, et cetera. And it was like, again, like all about this comportment with these Christian, tenets and all of this stuff. And it's just like it's a very interesting thing, like you say, like to kind of, yeah, anyway, there's some weird missionary stuff going on there for sure.
Well, it's an
Um,
idea of discipline. It's this like,
yeah,
I mean, in the gospel rescue missions, it's that like somehow taking Jesus into your heart will make you able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment.
right.
And it just is another strategy by which homelessness is, is individualized. And this,
Yeah,
like, it's part of this project of really like distracting us from the structural and
yeah.
economic conditions that produce homelessness.
Yeah, I've been on a kick lately of, like, digging into the proliferation of, like, self-help logics too within
Mm,
all of these, like, all carceral institutions and stuff like
mhm,
that, and, like, again, that shows up too in they'll say, like, "We're gonna teach you Christianity and self-help," right? Like, it's like,
mhm,
again, it's like putting everything onto the individual as, like,
mhm,
these are moral failings that have placed you in this position, and what you need is
mhm.
is moral to come to some moral understanding and of things that you need to ways that you need to behave to improve your personal lot. Yeah.
Totally. It's like
Um,
this fantasy that the fantasy of rehabilitation, right? This idea that like removing people from their communities, placing them in a cage will somehow like give them access to is a rehabilitative process, right? And of course of course it's not. But I think that that fantasy is like so embedded in like all of these carceral institutions. Absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm gonna pull in a couple audience questions
Mm,
before I ask my last one. So,
mm,
Yipper99 asked, wasn't sure was this mentioned. We didn't talk about New York, so no.
mhm,
But in New York, they are transferring old jails into quote unquote housing for homeless and migrants.
mhm,
Is this part of the current project both parties are doing? Probably not
mhm.
both parties, but do you want to talk about this dynamic at all?
Sure. I mean, I think that like, the migrant crisis really has a lot of overlap with the and when I say crisis, I'm putting in quotes, right? Because these are produced crises. These are political crises, which means that they have been engineered by policies and politicians over time. And so I think that and they share very similar dynamics, which is that as like both conservatives and centrists like basically attack and dismantle the bureaucracies that actually work to house people. That then what happens is that the visibility of unhoused people, the visibility of migrants, like that is what becomes the crisis. But of course, the crisis is actually the removal of resources and their sort of displacement into policing, right? Like that is the crisis, that you remove the bureaucracies and the resources, but what you see is the people themselves, and that the visibility of people in public space is what is being leveraged like in both places. And so I think that yeah, in the case of like turning literal jails into shelter, like I think that this is that it's a pretty excellent metonym for the sort of slippery way that even while there is amazing organizing work being done to decarcerate, to prevent the opening of new jails, that a lot of that like capture and containment of surplus people is being forced into the shelter system. And we see that the expansion of shelter in many ways via these like unaccountable nonprofit institutions, and also that, and like via these same disciplinary logics of like what people have to subject themselves to in order to access the basic services, like the meager services that would like help their lives. So I think that like yeah, I think there's a lot to be said there, and I hope that that's like helpful in naming some of those overlaps.
Absolutely. Shout out to Dindy. Good to see you. Dindy asks, says it's really cynical how punitive policies are framed as compassionate solutions. How can abolitionists reframe these talking points, particularly at a time when evidence-based arguments don't work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just the question. Like that is
Right.
the question, right? If evidence like evidence-based arguments don't work. And this is like, you see this in the friend of the court briefs where there's like all of the social scientific research is defending unhoused people's constitutional rights. Like there is no evidentiary basis for the criminalization of homelessness. There is no peniological purpose to it. It only serves to make people more precarious, like it to push people into more precarious lives and even deaths. And I think that in many ways, like, you know, you're just asking the same question that I'm asking. One of the ways that I'm trying to do it is with research and writing, and in, you know, like in ways that are like addressing, you know, that put people's actual lives first, you know, that like allows people to hear the sort of stories of, you know, John, who lost both of his parents and found himself living outside, like basically because of that crisis, or Helen, who works 2 jobs and still it's not enough to pay rent, or Megan, who is displaced because of climate change, right? Like because of the Alameda fire. And then like, and then the city impounded her car. So she's sleeping in a tent basically because of the city's own actions, right? And I think maybe for me, there's like, I don't know, it's like this is part of the work that I do, is try to, you know, like, is try to tell these, like try to use these stories and also put them in a context where we are like really thinking very clearly about the larger political project. And I think for me, helping, like for me, naming that context of the rightward shift on this issue has been really, I think for me, that's actually like one of the strategies that I'm trying to use, to like the strategy of embarrassment, basically, to say that like, how is it that liberals are finding themselves on the same side of the aisle as Joe Lonsdale, as Trump, as, you know, like I think because appealing to their morality doesn't seem to work, but perhaps appealing to their sense of like shame or hypocrisy might. And I mean, sometimes it might. I also think that like addressing it via political education, I mean, in the sense of like, what are we doing in our own communities to prevent people from, you know, like calling the cops on our unhoused neighbors, and like what are the systems that we're building like in our own communities to do that work. And you know, I've seen, so I'm also a tenant organizer. I helped start the Los Angeles Tenant Union, and like one thing that we talk about a lot, or we had talked about a lot, right, was like, you know, like what does a building do when someone is like living in the laundry room, right? And like people's initial response is to call the cops, right? Like that's the first thing. And these are tenants who are organizing against their landlord, right? Like that they are so much more proximal to that, the experience of living outdoors, the experience of needing to live in a laundry room, than they are to their landlord. But they're like a lot of times our first recourse is to call the cops. And so I think that interrupting that process just by like literally talking to people, or creating the democratic institutions that we need to like give people a sense of control over their lives, so that they don't seek to deputize that control to the cops. And so like, I mean, these are just like some, I mean, I think you're asking a really profound question that like plagues me all the time. And I'm just sort of giving you sort of like, you know, some of where my head is at in terms of doing that. But I think for me, it's really a matter of like, in some ways, like there is addressing the politicians via their own hypocrisy, but then there's also addressing each other. Like we need to rebuild the social fabric that is so rent by criminalization that criminalization becomes our like knee-jerk recourse, right? And I think that how we do that is by imagining other systems of care. Like I'm in a tenant union, and I think that that's part of what that project is about, is rebuilding democratic institutions so that people have control over their lives, and they have like projects to defend themselves collectively that are beyond the sort of like that are beyond like cops and cages. I hope that maybe addresses it somewhat.
I think it's a great answer, and I was glad that you got to the tenant union
Mhm,
organizing because I think that's certainly, I think
mhm,
organizing around these issues is key, and
mhm,
I also do appreciate what you're talking about in terms of trying to approach political education around these things
mhm,
in different ways, telling stories, all of that is important. I just want
mhm,
to share this with folks who might not be that familiar. Again, I mean, the Alameda fire was a massive story
mhm,
in 2020 when it happened. My parents used to live in Talent and fortunately had moved out of the
mhm,
town just like their old house was one of these houses that was burned. But that just gives folks some idea. I mean, it decimated
mhm,
entire small towns in Southern Oregon, and um, so much so, like, and it's also important to say that, like, people wouldn't know this if they didn't live there, but those were some of the few areas also where there was still some affordable housing
mhm,
within the region, right? And so, again, and wildfires are a huge, huge
mhm,
annual, massive problem
mhm,
in the Pacific Northwest now, increasingly in California and other places as well too.
mhm,
Um, and, so, yeah, I mean, that's another aspect of
mhm,
it is that houses are destroyed through climate change, which again, as we know, is fueled by capitalist relations and everything else.
mhm,
And then what gets replaced, right, is, there's real estate speculation and people build nicer homes and and they don't, they're never replacing the housing stock that was available to poor folks, which in part in like Phoenix and Talent included trailer parks, which, I mean, we could talk about that as a housing solution that's not that
mhm,
great either, but like at least for
mhm,
people that have no money, it's a place where they
mhm,
can sometimes afford to live,
mhm,
right? And so yeah.
mhm,
All right. I have so in closing, you know,
mhm,
obviously, given the context of the Supreme Court in general, but also specifically this Supreme Court, it's hard to imagine that this ruling will have a kind of positive impact on the situation. And you kind of alluded to that earlier
mhm,
of sort of the best thing that they could do would be sort of nothing, which is not
mhm,
likely. So, do you
mhm,
have some thoughts on like kind of I know you can't predict it, right? But
mhm.
how this might impact the kind of terrain of struggle around houselessness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And again, like, right, like what we're picking between is usual and unusual cruelty. And I think that no matter what, like we're facing this continued institutionalization of regressive and punitive and failed policies. But I think, just like looking at the oral arguments that when the case that went before the Supreme Court, I think we can sort of use that to kind of gauge like what could happen, right? And I think what I heard was like very much split on partisan lines, like Sotomayor saying, like, sleeping outside for an unhoused person is like breathing, right? And then meanwhile, Alito saying, like, is being a bank robber or a pedophile a status that should be protected by the Eighth Amendment, right? Like, so it's like it very much on partisan lines and like two extremes. And of course, the conservatives they have the majority, right? And they have the opportunity to basically say that, like, actually this question of like that the only thing, like one thing that um the lawyer for Grants Pass was basically arguing is that, like the Eighth Amendment doesn't protect status. The only thing that it protects is like from specific forms of punishment. So basically this idea that like you could, cities give out tickets and jail people all the time. Like the only thing that the Eighth Amendment would protect against is if we put homeless people in the stocks, right? And so that, like, one thing that could happen is that it could really remove the Eighth Amendment's protection of involuntary status. And that in protections of involuntary status is used for unhoused people. It's used for people who have any sort of addiction, right? That's like where we get the involuntary defense. And this idea of status versus conduct is from a case about addiction. And the idea that like you can't make being addicted to something a crime. So that is one thing we could see. And I think what I heard too, like, this didn't make it in the piece, but like, there was a lot of consensus around this idea that like, well, unhoused people don't need the Eighth Amendment because they still have recourse to common law, right? And so this is a baser form of law than the Constitution that they're suggesting that unhoused people could use, right? And this is where we get this idea of a necessity defense, right? Like, if you break a window to put out a fire, you can use the necessity defense to protect you from any sort of like punishments for having done that, right? And so what they're saying is that like, and of course this defense is retroactive, right? So only after you face a punishment could you have access to this defense. And what they sort of seem to be agreeing on is like, well, like, you could use this for sleeping outside. Like, you don't need the Constitution. You have this baser form of law on which it like the Constitution is supposed to be better protection from. So I think that's also really interesting and again terrifying. I think something else to notice, right, is that the Department of Justice, like the federal government, made a very rare appearance at the Supreme Court, and they can do this sometimes, and they only very rarely do, that they make their own argument to the court. And in this case, the DOJ, like, they presented their own sweep of McPherson Square in DC as the gold standard, right? And in that case, right, like afterwards, 2/3 of former residents were still living outside, right? So what they presented to the courts as the gold standard, which basically like immiserating people and shuffling them around. But more interestingly, right, like what they said was they were specifically saying that the court should rule in a middle ground way that would allow cities, like, that wouldn't legalize blanket bans, because like, like we don't want to criminalize homelessness, that's wrong, but we do want to give police officers the power to arrest and fine people based on the individual determination of their personal circumstances, right? And so this kind of like what they're calling a particularized inquiry. And that idea is basically like, what they want is to give police more power of discretion to name people as service resistant, to say like, you made a choice that we did not like, and so therefore we have the opportunity, even therefore we have the opportunity to ticket you, to jail you, to banish you from public space. And of course, like, when we open up the kinds of decisions that people are making on a daily basis, right? Unhoused people are making decisions like to not go into a congregate shelter for one night because it would mean giving up all of their outdoor supplies that they're going to need for the next one, right? Like, unhoused people are making the decision not to split from their partner or give up their pets or remove themselves from their social support network, right? Or like, I think, or like to not, in the case of Grants Pass, to not go into the gospel rescue mission where you have to pray to stay and like quit smoking, right? Like and so all of this DOJ push is really like institutionalizing a profound distrust for the agency of the poor, right? And I think when you put it in context, right, like this idea of this kind of paternalism and the rise of like this forced treatment model really like takes us back to like the era of the poorhouse, right? Like, it's like we're really stuck in this moment of throwback, in this moment of regression, where like in the poorhouse, people were forced to break rocks for a bed. And that was kind of the model of rehabilitation that was posed by like being in that space. And at the same time now we have like London Breed, who's like decided to drug test welfare recipients, like a policy pull from the 80s. And Gavin Newsom is reopening the asylums, right? And so I think that this kind of like regressive institutionalization of like distrust for the agency of the poor is like, it's like, I think that is really like the broad sweeping, like if I'm going to do some trend forecasting, like that's what I'm seeing. And of course, this is happening in the context of like a much deeper economic crisis, where evictions and rent increases have gone beyond pre-pandemic levels, and homelessness is skyrocketing, especially among seniors. And and also, I should say too, right? Like this is happening in this moment where like democratic mechanisms are like completely broken for us to exercise any kind of popular will. And I think, like this is like something that we're faced with most starkly in this moment of genocide, that like the majority of American people do not support this genocide, and yet they cannot enforce that will. And I think that, like, really to me, what this points us back to is like something that I was saying earlier, right? Which is that the terrain of struggle ultimately is shaped by our solidarity, right? It's like shaped by our willingness to like organize against state abandonment and state violence. It's like shaped by our capacity to make new institutions of care and support. And I think, like just to end, because I know I've gone on, but like, I feel like that really is our obligation to each other and to unhoused people and to the people of Palestine, right? Like this is like, we're really being faced with this obligation and this crisis. And I think that like really the only way to respond, right? Like the only way to look at that struggle is to shape it with like our collective, like to shape it with collective work.
Appreciated. Agree. Thank you so much for this conversation and for your work, for this piece. Again, it's linked in the show description. I encourage people to read it. I encourage people to read the previous one also on Inside LA's homeless industrial complex, and to follow your work. I look forward to your book coming out this
Thanks.
fall. I'm
Yeah,
sure.
I
I'm sure
should
we'll have a
say.
conversation when that happens
I'd
too.
love that. Yeah, I should
Yeah.
definitely give the plug. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, right on. And yeah, is there any other things that you want to mention just as before I let you go?
No, that's great. I mean, like the one thing to say really right now is like the only two words that I really ever want to hear are free Palestine, So I think just to like make sure that like that is where we end, and that as we think about this moment where like tents themselves are like have been politicized in on campuses and politicized in public space. I think that like also, like making sure that we understand that like deep connection to internationalist land struggle and the deep connection to like all forms of resistance, that we support. I think that just to end there, and yeah, to end with free Palestine always.
Absolutely. All right, I'm gonna let you go because there's just a couple things I want to plug to our audience. A couple upcoming conversations. But thank you so much, Tracy.
Thanks for
It's been
having
great to be
me.
in
I really
conversation with
appreciate
you.
it. Later.
Appreciate you. Yep. All right, folks. Thank you, Tracy, for that discussion and that piece. So later today, I just wanted to share we're gonna have a second live today at 6:30, 6:30 Eastern time, 3:30 if you're on the West Coast, and we're gonna be talking. I'm looking forward to this. We're gonna be talking with some workers, some organizers from um, UAW's 4811 chapter, which is the chapter that um, runs a large, I think it's like 40,000 40,000 university workers, right, in the University of California system. They started this past week with a strike at UC Santa Cruz, and so we're going to talk to folks from UC Santa Cruz about this. And I think they're going to expand it, which is something we'll talk about as well. But the origin of this strike is really interesting because you see this sign here at the bottom that says UAW loves Palestine, but it's ULP. So ULP stands for unfair labor practices. The unfair labor practices I mean, they'll talk about it more today and give us a better understanding. But as I understand it, it's basically the way that the UC system has worked to crush dissent right, around Palestinian solidarity organizing, including the encampment at LA, where the fascists came in and attacked everybody, and there was no protection for the university workers, right, who were a part of those protests, and the arrest of them, as well as, of course, um, whatever administrative penalties and things that workers are under. So, anyways, I say that to say I think it has the potential to be a very important strike, if they are successful, and again, we'll talk about what does success mean in a strike like this. Obviously, that has ramifications for labor around Palestinian solidarity organizing and anti-imperialism, and things like that. And so, and just generally around protests and organizing. And of course, if they are not successful, that also has significant implications. So, anyway, I look forward to that conversation as well. We have one tomorrow on Walid Daka's Searing Consciousness that I'm really looking forward to. I'll say a little bit more about that maybe as we close out our stream tonight. But thanks everybody for coming. Again, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. We're almost to 6,000. It would be great to get there. And thank you everybody that came through to listen to this. Make sure to share it with others as well. And hopefully I will see many of you this afternoon/evening for that UAW conversation.